Thank you everybody for coming. Welcome. This is the Consent Activism panel, past, present, and future. So we will be discussing activism in all three of those periods. We've got a great panel assembled. I know some of these lovely people already, but not all of you. So I'll briefly introduce myself, and then I'll turn it over to each of you in turn to just talk about yourselves and what you've been doing recently. My name is Zero. I am a member of the board of directors over at the Eulenspiegel Society at TESS. Amongst my many duties there, I am the chair of the Socials Committee as well as the DM Committee chair. So we work, my work takes me a lot with things on the ground in the moment where stuff happens, and coming from those perspectives, prevention, oh my God, it's a great thing because then there's less that I have to do it in a very short window of time at a 6-hour party and what could happen. And I'm really glad to say that some of the policies that we've implemented over the last 2 years, the changes, particularly the admission policy, has really improved a lot of things. I've had a lot fewer reported incidents since we've done that, but always looking to improve and keep making the situation better. So I turn it over to each of you, and we'll just go straight down the line. Please introduce yourself and let us know what you've been working on.
Yeah, talk for a few minutes about your work, too.
Do I have a timer?
Just
Just go.
Yeah.
All right. So hi, my name is Kate D'Adamo. I'm a longtime sex worker rights advocate. I was formerly the lead organizer for SWAP NYC, which is a peer and constituent-led organization of people that trade sex in the New York metropolitan area. After that, I was the policy and advocacy person at the Sex Workers Project at the Urban Justice Center, and now I do a lot of work around expanding the conversation about sex work as well as in policy. I work on prostitution laws, HIV criminalization laws, and a lot in actually anti-trafficking. And so consent, and I just talked a lot about criminalization, and so I think it's really important that consent for sex workers really is something that doesn't necessarily exist. You can consent to engaging in sex work, but it's still a criminalized activity. And when you are engaged in a criminal activity, reporting violence and victimization becomes that much more difficult. When you're afraid of getting arrested, reporting something that we know how low the rates of actually investigating and prosecuting sexual assault is, and we know how bad those outcomes are very oftentimes for victims. And so reporting that, there's often a barrier regardless, and reporting that under fear that you'll be arrested or deported becomes that much higher. And so I think primarily consent activism for folks in the sex worker community is decriminalization. It is about pulling the laws off the books which criminalize sex workers and really undermine where criminalization is basically turning a citizen into a criminal. It turns an act into a violation. And so removing those laws and removing that weight of criminalization from people that trade sex is, I think, my primary form of consent activism. Beyond that, there are steps that can be taken that I do want to talk about. Primarily, one of the ways that one city in particular has tried to address this is adopting an immunity policy where they've negotiated, and hopefully it's going to be implemented this year, or at least finalized this year, where it is a policy that says, regardless of whether you are engaged in prostitution, if you were victimized, you can come report and not fear that you'll be arrested for that. And so that's a really exciting development that we hope not only will get passed in that city, but also can be replicated throughout the country to at least, on the way to decriminalization, make it possible for people to report crime. I think the other piece of this that's really important is destigmatization. The decision to report isn't necessarily, for everyone, one of criminalization, but very often one of, will I be believed? Will I have a positive experience when I go to law enforcement to report this? Will I have a positive experience when I report this to a moderator? And so much of that comes down to is how much stigma that person is carrying, either for whether it's their identity as a sex worker, but their sexual history, the way they're perceived, whether or not they're documented, their gender identity. And so all of these things are really part and parcel to making it safe for people to disclose and not creating an easily victimizable population. Because when you criminalize and when you stigmatize, when you alienate people from the resources that the rest of us very often take for granted, what you're doing is creating a target population to be victimized.
I'm Russell Stambaugh. I'm a clinical psychologist. For a long time I was in private practice in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I have since retired. I'm here mainly because of my involvement with the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, ASECT. We train people to do work with various sexual problems. And one of the reasons ASECT exists is because sexuality in this country is so stigmatized that there are very few graduate programs in human sexuality and very little training available to people in regular psychology, social work, and other mental health training institutions. And so it's basically it's a postgraduate training. There's no money, there's no endowed chairs, it's just too much of a political scrum to try to do training for sexuality and work with sexuality. So having been there for many years, I joined ASECT in 1995. One of the things that I took on as a personal goal was trying to expand the field of sex therapy so that it didn't just cover sexual dysfunctions, but it talked about the relationship issues associated with sexuality, and particularly variant sexuality. We have a long history of social research that suggests sexual variability is way broader than public attitudes admit. And so a lot of my work has been about destigmatization and fighting stigma and getting a public understanding or acceptance of sexual variability being what it really is rather than what it is that we would prefer it to be. On that basis, I helped found the alt-sex special interest group in ASECT, where maybe at 10%, 15% of our members who are interested in this particular kind of work can go to make community, get training, and find out more specifically about the things that have to do with us. Why I was there and had that opportunity at all as a result of work NCSF was doing before I even joined. NCSF for a long time had a project called the DSM-5 Revision Project. It was about taking the language that was used in the DSM and having an opportunity for variant sexuality to be described without it being pathologized. Until through DSM-4, if you had variant sexual interest, they were pathological. With the revision in 2013, DSM-5, they succeeded in getting that language taken out. At that same time, I got ASECT to pass various position statements to the effect that BDSM was not inherently pathological, took aim against sex addiction and as junk science and basically not yet proven, and started to attack some of the ways in which stigmatizing ideology were prevalent in the mental health field and undergirded continuing marginalization of people in alternative sexualities. That effort to change DSM has had a big impact on what kinds of incidents NCSF has reported to it and how the outcome of various court cases happen. So the work of destigmatization, while it's a huge rugby scrum, and you saw some of that in the discussion from the legal panel, real progress has been made as a consequence of that work and that investment. So that's how I came to be here. I am now kink-aware professionals advocate for the National Coalition of Sexual Freedom and a member of the board of directors. The NCSF has had one of its services for a long time operated something called the Kink-Aware Professionals Program. And this was started by Race Bannon originally as a private list of people, mainly in the San Francisco area, who knew anything at all, people who were professionals who knew anything about kink, and were receptive to taking kinky clients and not stigmatizing them and working for their legal, medical, and other rights. And so I'm here to help make sure that professionals are getting educated so that they can be competently kink-aware professionals. And that's one of the consequences of the DSM revision, is that a number of people are starting to put together programs that provide training about BDSM so people know anything at all about what it's really about, who are professionals. And the fact is that of all the psychologists and all the social workers and all the marital and family therapists out there, there's still very little understanding of kink and its culture and its byways and the kinds of decisions that we take for granted here. It's a huge communication problem, so I've got job security, which is good because
Thank
it
you
does.
very much. I just want to keep it moving because we've got a very large panel. We've got a lot to get through.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Judy Guerin, and I direct NCSF's project called Consent Counts, which is focused on decriminalization of BDSM. I'm also a board member of NCSF. And I started, about 30 years ago, I started working on gender expression issues. I was on the board of a group called Gender Pack, and one of the first women in the 1980s to start teaching men, and then followed by women, to cross-dress. And it was illegal, I think, in about half the states in the country when I started doing that, and it's since transitioned into being something that's quite accepted and viewed as, quote, normal. In 1997, when NCSS was formed, I was asked to join NCSF as their executive director, which I did for 4 years. I moved on. I did other sexual freedom things for a number of years. And in 2006, NCSF held a roundtable, a leather leadership roundtable, at the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force's political conference called Creating Change. It's the largest LGBTQ conference, political conference in the country. And the number one priority that the leather community felt was the most important thing to do was to decriminalize BDSM. So we established a community-wide project of various groups and individuals and worked on it for about 2 years. We did surveys, we had in-person meetings with people around the country to try to figure out what we needed to do. Well, the first thing was obvious. We need to change the DSM criteria because we're not going to be able to legalize something that is mentally ill. And then we decided that we needed to come up with what consent meant. And that was a very difficult and extensive process through surveys and other things that we did in our communities. And it took us actually 6 years to get about an 80 or 85% agreement within our communities about the definition of consent, which was both a legal definition and, more importantly, even an ethical definition of how do we really view ourselves. Since that time, the project has done tremendous work. We actually increased our work with anti-domestic violence groups extensively. We started to work more with those who were survivors and deal with consent incidents, really from the survivor standpoint, on a somewhat regular basis. We do training programs throughout the country so that people who do anti-domestic violence understand what it is that we do and why we do it, so that victims have a place to go if they've suffered a consent violation. We're now working on a project to change the law, the Model Penal Code, with the American Law Institute, and that's going very well, and that's it for me.
My name is Heather Gardner. I'm advocate for the NCSF. I formerly served as their Mid-Atlantic Region advocate, and now I'm just doing advocacy for them because other responsibilities took me from that. A few years ago, developed an organization with a few other people called Consent Rocks, and we go into large-scale events and help with any consent issues or incidents that occur there at that event. We also recently, in the past year, have begun doing consulting services with organizations and events on how to better handle their own situations with leadership, presenters, attendees, anyone that's problematic, and how they can better deal with those things in the best way for them. It's all very case by case. Other than that, I'm a paralegal in my normal life, and it doesn't help me at all in this area. But it's interesting to take these sort of law things that I find with the NCSF back to work and discuss with the attorneys there.
Hi, my name is Mistress Lee. I am a professional dominatrix and fetish educator, travel and lifestyle dungeons, teach other professionals. Also the Alternative Sexuality Advisor for the SOAR Institute, which is a Brooklyn-based policy and advocacy organization for sex workers and survivors of trafficking. I'm a genderqueer. I am interested in human sexuality research and currently starting my application process for a PhD program, so hopefully that will pan out.
So you're a masochist.
So I'm a masochist.
Oh, yeah.
And what else? I'm also a media consultant for television and film on portrayals of BDSM and fetish in media. Malvi, definitely talk on a lot of podcasts, and you can't shut me up about alternative sexuality and BDSM. I also co-facilitate the Dominant Women's Submissive Men's group for TESS, and even though I identify and present in a lot of different ways, very happy to be here, and I believe that is it.
Hi, I'm Renee Easterbrooks. I am a survivor of sexual and domestic violence. I've worked in a number of capacities as an attorney, as an advocate for survivors of sexual and domestic violence, both here and internationally. I've worked in this field for 30 years as a pro bono advocate and as a supporter. I'm currently in the academy as an ethicist and philosopher teaching at local colleges in the Hudson Valley. And my area of expertise is consent, First Amendment, and basically protection for people who have been harmed in some way. My interest is in helping develop understandings of consent, the importance of decriminalization for all of us, and to help continue the education for especially people who are young or young in the scene.
Well, thank you all for being here. So I'd like to start, and I'm actually going to go the opposite way back around. Just in your various advocacy roles that you're out there doing this activism, what kind of approaches and tactics do you find to be particularly effective when talking about consent? And are there others that you've tried that you've actually found to be not effective that you would actually recommend avoiding those kinds of tactics?
As an educator for a long time, and now working in the academy with people who are 17 through about 30 years old in general, the tactics that don't work are to try to tell young people what to do. And I think we can all remember back to when we were 17, 18, 19, nothing any adult had to say, even if it seemed correct on the surface, it was just going to rub us the wrong way. So I try to use game theory, especially in my ethics classes, role play, having people step outside of their comfort zones and consider other opportunities for their own play, what is important to them, and be willing to take risks to contemplate really bad outcomes and how they might avoid them.
My experience working primarily in consent with other fetish and sex workers, as they are new doms that are interested, or new submissives professionally, or new switches, is to talk to them about their agency and to really encourage them to not think in terms of just financial aspects, but also to think about their emotional and physical safety in a myriad of ways, whether they're top or bottom or somewhere in between as a professional. It's mostly talking to them about their own consent that they would apply into a lifestyle context. To take that and to extend it in a professional context, that just because their money is there doesn't mean that you have to make consent issue violations for yourself as a provider for money.
So in advocacy, what I found is most effective is empathy and just being there to hear the person and offer support. That has been, I think, the most huge thing I've seen over the years doing advocacy with victims and with anyone involved in any issues. It's usually very important for them to just be heard and to have you offer whatever you can to help them. Though I haven't tried it, what I think is very ineffective is talking down to someone or trying to teach them how to behave. There's a Brene Brown quote, and I'm sorry I don't know the exact quote, but it's nobody reaches out to you for compassion for you to teach them how to behave. They reach out to you to help them move toward the light. So it's just sitting with the person in the dark and trying to talk to them, listen to them, and move them toward a better behavior.
I've really come to this more from a sexual freedom standpoint versus a consent standpoint. And I talk primarily to audiences that would be considered vanilla audience, like the Pop Culture Association or universities. And what I find works well in any of these dialogues is to really start at the level that the person can hear you. So if I'm talking to certain individuals, they may not even be comfortable talking about sex, and then introducing something that would be very non-threatening to them about sex and sexuality. Maybe talking about people who are intersexed and people who are genderqueer and discrimination against those particular people. The importance of consent is something that I deal with a lot with prosecutors and with people involved in situations involving consent and consent violations, and really stressing the importance of consent within our own communities, and talking about how our focus of consent is something that's not only important for our communities, but it's important for the broader public. So I'm more focused on getting people to understand that consent is important, that negotiation is important, that you do have the ability to negotiate sex, which most people don't do.
I have two main strategies, one of which is really very similar to hers, and that is there's been a 30-year discourse within BDSM about consent, and right now the general society is starting to recognize that they have a lack of conversation about consent problem. And so BDSM's history of 30 years might actually have something to offer them, and that rather than just being people to be stigmatized, people who are in alternative sexualities and alternative lifestyles have something to tell conventional people about how to live a better life. The other way in which I've attacked stigma is one about cultural competence. I'm mainly talking to professional groups, and as a professional, your doctor, your attorney, your psychologist has a responsibility to practice competently within the scope of their practice. And that means they need to know something about who it is that they're treating, and that means being culturally conversant in who it is that they treat, and that means knowing something about BDSM as a lifestyle and what the ground rules are, and of course that means talking about consent all the time.
Not to kind of duplicate what we said, because I really value everything that folks have brought forward. I think the piece that I would add is that when I talk about, I often don't actually talk about consent when I work with folks who are trading sex. It's a lot about making the decision that's right for you, and maybe that is a survival decision. Maybe it is a decision based on, these are my circumstances and I'm comfortable. What do I want to do? What I don't want to do? But understanding that, what you do with your body is part of a constellation of decisions that you're making every day, and those are really based on your circumstances. And your circumstances change, and sometimes those are circumstances about, I'm sick and I don't want to do this today. Sometimes those are circumstances I'm sick and I don't want to do this today, but my car just broke down and I need $500 really fast, and so I don't really want to do this, and I don't really want to see this client, but I don't feel like I have another option. And not personally stigmatizing that. I think very often we have these ideas about consent, about what we want to do and the people that we want to always portray and always be, and I don't do X, Y, or Z, and I definitely don't do X, Y, Z for money, and I definitely don't do X, Y, Z for that amount of money. But sometimes we just have to make decisions, and recognizing that that's okay, and recognizing that, even if we do have to make a decision that isn't the situation that we thought we were ever going to be in, sometimes we do, and those are valid, and you still deserve the respect that you came into that space with. You deserve respect leaving that space. You deserve respect in that next situation. And you shouldn't stigmatize yourself for looking at your circumstances and making the best possible decision, even if it's a decision you didn't think you were ever going to make.
So what I'm hearing a lot of is varying approaches of educating either individuals, the general public, in some cases professionals. What I would be curious, we didn't touch it, but some of you have touched on your previous work, particularly with relation to the revisions in the DSM, more formal lobbying efforts, whether that is to something like the DSM, whether that's to legislatures, both state and national, whether that's to courts, those kinds of more institutional advocacy tactics and roles.
One of the first projects we did, started in 1997 with NCSF, was a law enforcement outreach program, which has been very, very effective. And we help people, if they want to do outreach to law enforcement, we teach them how to do that, how to do it with prosecutors. With respect to lobbying, we have done lobbying successfully on several different laws. I will cite an example. In Washington, D.C., it is legal to have sex and do BDSM in alcohol venues, and that took us 4 years to legally get that changed. So we have a very active scene in the Washington, D.C. area as a result of that. We've also done lobbying on strangulation laws, which are pretty prevalent. I think almost all the states have them now. When it was early and starting to be introduced, it came to our attention that these laws, the way they were worded, could put us in jeopardy of, if you had a hood too tight, or you had somebody, wrapped in bondage that was really too tight, could that be interpreted as strangulation? So we've had success in getting those laws modified so they don't really impact us as much as they might have. One of the things that we will be doing lobbying on is we're working with the American Law Institute to change the model penal code, which is what most states adopt when they look to change their laws. And so they're in their final stages, which might mean another year or two, because this is a long process that they go through to develop these codes. But we are hopeful that we will have something that we will be able to, maybe in a year and a half, launch on a statewide basis and actually start teaching people to lobby and start lobbying efforts on a state-by-state basis with folks.
And the ALI project.
That is the
consent. The defense is a legal defense.
Yeah, well, the ALI project is basically working on decriminalization of BDSM and moving it into a sexual assault category. So right now in the United States, no appellate court has held that consent is a defense if it's a BDSM case.
Anything to add there? All right, moving on.
Sorry.
Just one thing. Not so much on the lobbying, but I do political performance art with using BDSM as basically kind of a tool to talk about other intersectional issues of respect. And for me, issues with the environment are directly tied into issues of violation and consent as well. When it comes to violations of the environment, for me there's a direct kind of crossover with issues of teaching people about respect for our world and each other's bodies. And so for me, sometimes I enjoy using BDSM as a tool to also intersect with other issues.
So I do a ton of lobbying working with institutions, and considering decriminalization is really the most kind of singular thing that the sex worker community can come together on. It's really important to talk about the ways that folks are policed and the ways that folks are criminalized. In New York State, I'm just going to assume everyone's from here. But there are things that people can do at the state and local level if you do want to get politically involved, and I'm going to take the opportunity to plug it. So in New York State, there is an access to condoms bill, which has been introduced every session for the last 20 years. It says that you cannot use condoms as evidence of prostitution. And it's pretty basic. It means that you can't be arrested for having condoms on you and being profiled as a sex worker. So that is always in the New York State Senate and House or Assembly. On the city level, there's actually a lot that the New York City City Council can do. Right now, they're really heavily involved in what are essentially diversion courts. So where when folks are picked up for prostitution, they are forced to go through six sessions of counseling, which is often longer than the mandate if they were actually arrested and charged and sentenced for prostitution. Those charges mean that you have an open case hanging over your head for as long as it takes to deal with those sessions. It means that very often you have to spend an incredible amount of time going from borough to borough to see a case manager, and it means that they assume that you're doing sex work because you need a counselor and not because you need a job. And so if you do want to get involved in an issue, call your rep on the city council and talk to them about this, and talk to them about how the city council is actually funding a lot of these processes, and they've had hearings on this and have already seen from service providers and from victims of trafficking this is not an effective process, and it actually increases the burden for people who are involved with who are system involved. And so if you want to reach out to your city council rep and let them know that this is not effective and that the city council should actually take that money and fund service programs and especially the housing that folks are clamoring for and not sessions of counseling, that would be great. Also, if you want to call your state senate, if you want to call either Schumer or Gillibrand and let them know that the trafficking bill that they are backing increases the amount of money that is going towards John stings, you can let them know that too.
Any last thoughts on that?
Do you have a website that they can go to, or any place where they can find this?
You can tweet at me.
Okay.
Hopefully that will be coming. But yeah, right now, just to let you guys know, I'm an independent advocate, and so if you want to find out more, you just have to contact me directly. But I'm really accessible. I'm always at home.
In my field, research is advocacy. The vast majority of research that's been done on BDSM is way more liberal, more permissive, more accepting than the vast majority of social policy. And so doing research and getting word about the existing research out to professionals is extremely helpful. It's why it is that NCSF was able to be successful with the DSM committee in the first place, and it works with other professionals who are not on the decisive committees that draw up documents like the DSM.
All right, so the next, if I can diverge slightly before we go any further, I'd be a little bit remiss if I did not point out kind of the one-sided demographics of this panel, myself included. And I would hope that that is not representative of everyone who is working in the general field of consent activism and all these various myriad, all-important kind of issues. But that said, what can we all do to bring more diverse voices to this conversation, particularly in light of that those who come from backgrounds that are more historically marginalized have really the most at stake in these conversations and should be part of them. So whoever would like to start.
Well, I'm going to begin by copping to the fact that sex therapy in particular has a very big problem with exactly that issue. And that's true for all of the professions to some extent, because part of the issue of professionalism is to create hurdles for people to get clear, to show that they have legitimacy, and people who have historically not been legitimate don't have easy access to the resources to clear those hurdles. So ASECT is working very hard at trying to get minority participation up. And we're very well represented with sexual minorities, but we're very poorly represented by racial minorities, and very poorly represented by people who are economically marginalized. We have hardly any sex workers ever been licensed at ASECT. So this is it's admitting that you have a problem is the first place to start. And we're doing things about it, but they do take time. And it's hard to join an organization where you don't see anybody like yourself and where there's very little institutional support. And frankly, the professional organizations aren't rich. So it's not like they have lots of money that they look like they're rich, but they aren't.
We have a question from the
Why
audience.
would you say you'll find others? Why?
If you come to ASECT, you're not going to see lots of other black faces in the room. And so it's a burden for people who come in to identify themselves as part of a group where there's hardly anybody who's made a similar decision it is a greater act of courage to join ASECT as a black person than it would be to be a white person who's already got a PhD. Yeah.
On that note, so I am a multiracial, genderqueer person that sometimes presents as male and often gets mistaken as a female, white person. And so in that space, there comes a very particular way to navigate through lots of different experiences. And I tend to experience like a lot of, problems with people feeling that there's not a space for their community, and kind of echoing what you're saying is like, okay, well, if I don't see people who look like me, and that's across the gender spectrum too, there's a difficulty with wanting to be a part of activism in general. For my gay brothers, I see a lot of difficulty with actually in specifics for like sex workers. I have brothers that are gay identified and hetero identified that don't identify as sex workers even though they are doing sex work. So on that space it becomes difficult because they don't identify with what we're talking about here. And so if someone doesn't even recognize that they are a part of a group or doesn't identify with that, it's very difficult to get them on board, if that makes sense. So that's what I run into a lot.
So the irony is that in my field there are very few women ethicists. I am, in essence, a unicorn. So I bring to my teaching in the academy my own personal experiences as a survivor, and having worked in the field as a domestic and sexual violence advocate, and also someone who has definitely survived all of the different levels of experience. And I really care about the pedagogy. So I have created in my classes in the academy a way for my students to experience me as a mother, I have a 19-year-old, and also as a survivor, and as an attorney, and as someone who cares about the philosophical underpinnings. I require them to go to a deeper place. And I'm bringing to them something that I don't see my brethren in philosophy using the same applications. And I really believe that it's a chance for my students to get a different take on their day-to-day decisions about consent, agency, and what's important to them about their sexual exploration.
I apologize, Lee, if I made assumptions about your background identity, but that actually leads me to a follow-up question about that. What difficulties do you all encounter in your advocacy roles when you are encountering populations that rightly or wrongly perceive you as other, and therefore how does that complicate having those conversations and providing the information and the advocacy?
Well, I like the element of surprise in general. I'm like, people can see me in any type of way. I mean, I really don't care, to be honest. If I could have a D, all of the above, I'd probably check that box in a lot of ways. And so the element of surprise is great because people aren't editing themselves. They're just talking about how they feel about things. And I feel like it's fine to be like, oh, by the way, you could call me she, you could call me he, I don't really care, or otherwise. I take a different approach to it. A lot of people, it's very important for them to identify in a very specific way, and that identity brings aspects of respect and important emotional aspects. For me, that's not the case. So I feel like that the flexibility there, the element of surprise is great, because then I can kind of just be like, hey, by the way, like, did you consider that maybe that not looking at this person thinking they're white, or like whatever the case, like, or also, for me, I don't really care that much, so it's like you're welcome to do that, but as long as you see me as a human, first and foremost, we can find common ground there and move into the political aspects and move into my identity politics and move into that. But I think the important thing is to find a baseline of coming together, because you can always build on that. Baseline is really good to when you know somebody respects you as a human, you can move through all the particulars and the problems from there, in my experience.
I guess to build on that, and I also identify as fair-skinned, multiracial, so passing privilege is super real. I think so much of this, especially because the work that I'm doing right now is a lot about figuring out how to bring conversations about sex worker rights to other spaces, and especially to other spaces that recognize that it's an issue but don't necessarily know how to integrate that dialogue or really construct solutions that are based on the experiences of people most impacted and most marginalized. Kind of, I think, speaking to the last question, very often, especially when you have national organizations, are you working with folks on the ground who are in a locality experiencing that? Are you working with trans-led organizations? Are you working with people of color-led organizations? Is the management of the direct service organization all allies, and everyone who is not management of people of color and trans folks and sex workers? That's going to create a really specific dynamic, and that really informs the work that's going to be able to happen. And so I think working with groups where you are viewed as another is absolutely essential to meaningful progress. I am very much of the collective liberation mentality. And so I think working in spaces that you say, I am viewed as another, I am not part of your community, I'm not speaking for your community. I want to identify these common goals and recognize how this singular common goal, even though we have completely different ends, if we can work together, I think that it's going to be the most robust activism as possible. I'm working actually on a federal bill right now, and I'm working with First Amendment folks, and I'm working with tech folks, and they all have completely different lines of thinking, and they want something completely different out of it. And I even had someone say to me, not everyone here, you need to know in this space that not everyone here agrees with sex work. And not everyone, and there are people here that think it's inherently exploitative, and there are people here that are absolutely okay with trying to shut down the sex industry. And I said, we can talk about that in 5 years when I feel personally connected to talk about your feelings on prostitution. But right now we have a really tangible goal in front of us, and as long as you agree that doing this will cause more violence to sex workers, that's all I need you to agree on right now. We can talk about those differences when they come up and when they matter, and I can tell you if one of your strategies does perpetuate harm against my community, because that happens a lot. But if we can identify something common, then being viewed as another is, to me, viewing an experience that I'm not going to have, and for me, mitigating a lot of the mistakes that I could be making along the way if I didn't actively seek out groups where I felt like another.
Well, that actually leads really, really well into my next question, which is when you have groups within our communities that don't have viewpoints that diverge, that do not necessarily agree on an issue such as the legal status of sex work, how do you build that consensus and get to a point of collaboration? Do we have a question?
I did. I had a question that...
Before we move on to that, then...
It was a question of how can someone in an organization, which I thought you were going to diverge, in an organization where you want to attract other viewpoints and other personalities and other life experiences, how can you encourage people to join in and voice their concerns and participate without making somebody feel tokenized? Walking into a room and seeing nobody that looks like you or presents as you or acts as you or identifies as you, how can you encourage people to come in? And I loved how you pointed out that seeing somebody as human first. How can you get people to, not get, but how can you foster that?
So what I've found the best way to do that is to go to those groups and talk to them and ask them how you can create a space that they feel comfortable coming into. And that is the only way, really, that anyone can do that is, unless you hold events that are solely for separate groups, which you're not wanting, you're wanting
right.
to have people all come together. So we've had this discussion a lot in the last few years, and someone a year or two ago said, if you really want to create spaces where everyone feels welcome and where everyone feels that they can go there, go out and ask those people, what can we do to create this space? And it's happened in some areas.
When you hear the response of, well, I go and I don't see anybody there that looks like me, or I don't feel comfortable because this, I don't know how to say to somebody, come back.
So
I hope you come back, because then someone else can see, look. But I also
Right.
don't want somebody to feel like I just want you because of how you look, how you present. I want people because I want people to participate and be a part of it and enjoy it just as much as I do.
So when you go to the larger events, and Tess is a good example,
Yeah.
they'll have a queer mixer, they'll have a people of color mixer, you could have events in your own group such as those, and then try to foster those people, all of those groups, anyone, to come to your other events, but you have to make them feel comfortable first.
Yeah.
And it's up to you to reach out to them to figure out ways and find better ways to bring them into your community. Unfortunately, we don't have a magic pill
Right.
to give you to hand out to people to make them feel comfortable.
Had something.
No, just I think that the issue of being anyone's token anything has to deal with. That's really focusing on not humanizing someone.
Right.
When you
Exactly.
So the way to combat that is to just be human and to enjoy people as they are and who they are. And
Sure.
I think that if you every once in a while, maybe I'll ask myself hard questions like, how's my diversity? Right? And that can be like, oh, are you making sure you have all your token friends? It's like, no, it's like, am I choosing to only be surrounded by people who think like me? Every once in a while, I'll do that with myself. And I'm not talking about racial issues. I'm not talking about gender. I'm just talking about politically. I'll ask myself that question. I have that for myself first because I can't expect to do anything or be an activist if I don't ask myself that question first. But I think a big thing is just to like mingle yourself with things that are maybe a little uncomfortable, just because it's so easy to just hang out with people who will drink the same beer as you do. You know, everybody likes to, you know, it's the human nature to kind of link up with people who have similar interests or background than you. So for me, to combat that like natural kind of whatever, I purposely do things like that to just shake it up. Because why not? You know what I mean? It's not hurting anybody, and I'm not seeing anyone, but I'm talking about political, whatever it may be. And so I think that relationship is key to a lot of these things. Is having relationships with people who are different than you. Why not?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? If you choose
Yeah.
people who are the same, why not choose people who are different? You know what I mean?
I think that it's important to go into areas where you are uncomfortable in order to increase diversity. And when I came into the scene a long time ago, there really weren't educational groups. I mean, there was TESS, but it was new, and there really wasn't anything in Washington, D.C. So I went to the gay male group, and they were more than welcoming. And they encouraged me to go to gay male events. It was very uncomfortable to be like the 4 women with 1,000 guys at a title holding contest. It was not comfortable. But what that did is really increase the diversity of their things. And as it, over time, I mean, there's more and more women titles holders and things like that. So I do think it's important to like put your foot forward, not just expect them to come to you.
And I think one of the ways in which this community is a really great example is in tolerating discomfort. And I use it all the time when I talk to therapists and people. If you're going to do work with people, you have to be able to tolerate your discomfort about their discomfort. And it's great to see people who are actually practicing going towards what it is that they are uncomfortable about. And that happens a lot in kink. This is another thing that the vanilla world can learn from kink, is tolerating your discomfort. I use that all the time. So does that mean that people are tolerant? Not always, but it helps. And mainly I say that to people who are in majorities or uncomfortable about having new faces in the room, rather than I say that to the one person who happens to be black. Like, well, you just have to tolerate your discomfort. There's nobody around that's black yet. They'll come eventually. That may actually be true, but mainly it's the discomfort of your group with people coming in who are new that sends the message to people that makes it hard for them to stay, not just how they do a quick detection of the demographics.
I think also the difference between tokenization and not tokenizing someone is really about whether or not you're putting them in a leadership role.
Mm-hmm.
I've been to so many listening sessions that don't matter. And so I think making the effort to go out and say to a group of folks, even if you're making yourself uncomfortable, but I think step one is to approach their space with humility, first and foremost. And then asking them and saying, like, why is my space inaccessible to you? And taking responsibility to that is, it should be really humbling. And and it is also emotional labor on the other side. And so I would say really taking that, and then at the end of the day, I think very oftentimes we actually do have to incentivize these spaces. Like, there is a historical legacy of kink spaces being really not welcoming to a lot of folks, and having an entire room of people not examining socio-political power while engaging in intentional power exchange is, I mean, at best, it's straight fucked up. And so I think really taking stock of what it means to create these spaces, and what it means to create these spaces built on a legacy of racism, of transphobia, of economic injustice, is really important. And I think we have to really go back and re-examine so many of these spaces, and especially the things that we loft and the things that we don't. The way that we fetishize things and what that means about these spaces and how welcoming they are to folks. I know I said in the other room, like, I don't call a safe space somewhere where people are throwing the word "or" around. It's things like that we really actually have to take stock. And so when I think the level of discomfort needs to go to the level of, are we problematizing and questioning our own relationships to power and the way that they are being played out for folks, and the way that as people with privilege, with the disposable income and the time and the money to attend these events, what does that mean for us to intentionally exchange power in a way that you don't get to if you're a trans woman of color walking out of a space, or walking into a space like that? And so I think that, there are like diversification of parties and non-gendered bathrooms are super important. And I think there needs to be a moment where we need to actually sit down and analyze what we're creating in these spaces and the way that it plays out in a socio-political space. If you want more women, we get paid 70 cents to the dollar. Maybe we should have a 70% ticket. And so looking at the ways that those are all reaffirmed and those are all assumed to be kind of a baseline, as opposed to intentional decisions that we're making to reaffirm power structures.
We also have to recognize, and I hate to say it, but people's right not to be a part of our communities.
Yeah.
Sorry, but there's sometimes my trans sisters that don't want to be in a place where they are like the minority just from a number situation. Or my lesbian sisters are like, we want to have like our leather space for only women. And as a marginalized community, within a marginalized community, and we're really good at factioning off, we have to respect other people's right to have their own space. So it's like, as much as we're saying this, we also got to recognize that people have the right to not be a part of our community if they don't want to. But as people, as we're trying to create diversity, we have to recognize that it's like, that's our goal. That may be not their goal.
Right.
It's like there were a lot of those, gay clubs in Chicago that were like locking down their space against bachelorette parties years ago, because they were tired of having, cis, hetero women come in and commandeer their space. So I hate to be like that person, but it's a reality when you are a, marginalized people group. It's like, do we have the right to say to them, like, you need to come to our space? Or, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. Anybody?
Let me actually tweak it.
In the back.
I was saying, I agree with that. I don't know what we can do, but marginalized community, any kind of minority, their strength comes from each other. They have to come together. How, as an outsider, you can, promote that, I'm not sure, but that's a difficult thing to support as an outsider. But I've been associated with some other groups in New York, and it's interesting to see how minorities come together and give each other support, and the strength that you see developing, and they have an understanding of each other that other people do. So that's important.
Let me slightly reframe and go back to you guys then. If the goal is not to get diverse groups all to be one big group altogether, or all to be joined and be one circle and one pie, how do we at least get those circles to occasionally intersect and make a Venn diagram? And I have in mind, at least in New York, no longer a thing, but there used to be Leather Pride Night. So LSM does great work, and they are a fantastic organization, and they don't need to be under the umbrella and the auspices of texts. They're great doing their thing, but it would be nice once or twice a year to still come together, even just socially.
For like
so
a
that-
consent summit or something?
Not well, that would be one thing, but I think also
We are in the LGBT.
I think also just socially is important because forming those bonds in a more relaxed atmosphere will foster coming back and have fond memories when chips are really down and having each other's back. So those kinds of structures, how could we foster something like this?
I think we're doing it now. I think we're here in an LGBTQ space trying to do that, and I think if we had more options and opportunities for an intersectional, like yearly events, like you were saying, I think it would be great because people can opt out if they want to opt out. They can opt in if they want to opt in.
And fostering the conversation, which we're doing here today as well, that could continue, be an ongoing conversation and dialogue, between cultures, subcultures, to try to better that if it's something that everyone wants.
One of the things that's also starting to happen around the country are what's called community town hall groups. So in the Mid-Atlantic area, it started in Baltimore. We have a fairly large community town hall group, and they have a couple representatives from each group can come, and they meet, however often they decide to meet, be it twice a year, once a quarter, whatever. But they have very active email lists, and they share information, and they communicate, and they occasionally come together. And it's been extremely effective in our area, and we've been helping other people form those groups around the country. So, and that also has the advantage of when we get to the point where we're actually going to be able to change the laws, we have a way to go to a group that can disseminate to 100 groups in the area.
All right. Any other questions from the audience before we move on? All right, so I'll throw back to my previous question. When we are working toward some kind of a common goal, but there might be divergent views on how to get there, or we don't necessarily even quite that common goal, particularly around consent issues. One of the things that comes to mind for me personally is a lot of the op-eds back and forth that I've been reading very recently in the New York Times regarding the Title IX guidelines for sexual assaults on campuses. And as somebody who's not directly, I'm not a college administrator having to make these decisions, thank goodness, but trying to balance concerns like protecting the privacy and believing victims and those kinds of things with things like due process of the accused and making sure that whatever punishments are handed down or whatever the adjudication is fair, is corrective, prevents further instances, as opposed to pushing people into the shadows where they're likely to reoffend, those kinds of things. So when you have such divergent viewpoints, how do you build that consensus to actually start creating policy changes?
I want to clarify the question. Are you asking, are you making the correlation to the kink community, or are you actually
that was just
talking
one
about
example of something
campus?
that I see a very public debate of two clear sides looking at an issue that both are saying this needs to be fixed, but a clear disagreement on what and how. And there are myriad other examples. That was only one. But more my question is about consensus building. And you touched on earlier that you work in policy areas with people who actually want to continue and to completely eliminate sex work as a thing that exists in the world. So how do you overcome those challenges?
No, it's a great question, because I think especially in so many of these areas, you have to be able to work across these lines. You have to be able to work with, victims advocacy groups and as well as, sex offender registry groups and navigate all of those. And everyone in the end of the day has different ultimate end goals. I think, and I'm really excited to hear how everyone else wants to answer this. I think for me, step one is do no harm and then move from there. We can all come together on this kind of central goal. We know our baseline, we know our target, and it's the strategies in the meantime. And there's a myriad different strategies. We can all figure out what's great. But do we have the ability and the accountability to each other? And that's what I think it comes down to. Do you have the accountability of the people who are impacted by the decisions that you make? To say, like, maybe you do want to shut down the sex industry. Let's everything that you do on this campaign, everything that we do together, I can come to you and I can say, like, the language on this is actually really stigmatizing. Can we please work together to figure out something? You know, it's I think that ability to be accountable to each other and be accountable to understanding that everyone has different goals and different limitations and different restrictions is something that I think you just have to be aware of when you're working with folks, especially across disciplines and across outcomes. And recognizing that those limitations also provide for benefits that I don't have access to, and this is why we're working in collaboration together. But I feel like if you start from a place of, you know, this is mitigating the unintended consequences, everything else can just be building from there.
I think it's also really important to really listen to what is motivating that person and to understand what their motivation would be in supporting your particular issue. And I think that takes a lot of understanding and a lot of time so that you're building a consensus with different groups, all for different reasons. So as an example, I've often gotten a lot more support from the religious political extremists because they have a libertarian view than I've gotten from the left-wing kind of progressive people. So I think there's always some little niche where you can find some kind of consensus, but you really have to listen and understand their motivations.
I think within the key culture, especially the town hall is a great example of where this is something we see. We have the community town hall in the Mid-Atlantic region has, I want to say, between 40 and 50 groups and organizations that participate, and they each send 2 representatives. So when you have a meeting, there are a lot of groups there who don't get along with each other a lot, and that have very different views and really, you know, adversarial relationships. So when you come together in a space to try to discuss, it's important to remember to respect everyone's opinion, even if it's not your own. And we have to give everyone the space to speak and tell everyone what their issues are, what their needs are, and what they're looking for from other community members. I've seen those egos get together, and I'm not putting them down because I'm one of the people that go to those meetings, but I've seen the group of people come together, and there's a lot of ego in that room. And there's a lot of people who believe they're right and the other people are wrong in that room. And at the end of the day, you can walk away still believing you're right, but maybe seeing someone else's point of view and why they believe that the way that they believe and why they're making the decisions they're making. So it's important to, if you have some ground rules, for instance, for those meetings, people cannot yell at each other, you know, etc. They have to be respectful of others, not swear or attack anyone, even though the next day we may see them doing that online. Luckily, it's not in person loudly, but those are important things, I think, and it has really furthered our community, and it's made a lot of positive changes.
So you mentioned Title IX and being on a college campus and knowing that every college and every university now has to hire and keep hiring Title IX reps for every single school. And so my experience is I deal with the students personally, and they're having their own issues, whether it's kink relations or it is discovering their own sexuality and their parents not accepting it, having to move out. Some of my students are living in their car because they're not allowed to go home. And these are some of them are very wealthy students. They have to make very important decisions with not great references and not really a lot of support. Title IX ostensibly is there to protect the individual students, but my students who have gone through different Title IX experiences in various colleges have said at the beginning and the end of the process, they're very well aware that it's the university's benefit that is overriding the individual's benefit. So I see a potential conflict of interest, and my perspective is always going to be to support my students in their learning. And it's also tricky for me because I'm a representative of the university. So it's very tricky. I think we have to listen, as Heather was saying. Every single person's needs have to be heard and addressed, and hopefully crawl forward as a unified energy to solve some of the problems and offer opportunities for everyone to be heard.
I have a little bit of a biased perspective as a person who loves science, but I really feel that our community needs to get more involved with participating in research on our community. And the reason why is because there's a lot of debate and opinions are like assholes. Everybody's got one, right? So in my community of sex work, there's a big debate between the idea of, criminalization. Of course, most of us want that, overwhelmingly so, but there's like debate on whether it should be regulated or not. And we need more research. And I think that's, if we can, as a community, start like doing more surveys and getting more involved in the research on our community, we can have a little bit more ammo to come against these things, and also maybe try to change our perspective where we maybe have had one perspective and the data shows something that is probably contradictory to it, to be able to be flexible. So I think that science is key to that, and I think that if we can become a part of our own solution by participating in studies, if we can do that, and and being advocates of science, to be able to actually have some solid foundation to talk about these things.
So I love you for bringing that up, because that actually leads me perfectly to the next question.
We did not plan that,
which is in the BDSM community, in the poly community, in any kind of these subcultural communities, a lot of the people, even those who have some of the loudest opinions on FetLife, they'll shout that from the rooftop on FetLife, but as soon as it's there's like a formal survey, I can't be out, right? And there's legitimate concerns with that. So what structures can we do to bring people into, whether it's being surveyed, whether it's a more formal activism role, who have concerns about how publicly they want to be out? Even myself, I mean, I kind of almost felt a little blindsided. I'm like, I'm sending a video disclosure form today. Did not realize that. It's more important that we be here and we be doing this. So that was my calculus. Not everyone's going to be comfortable. So how can we make people more comfortable stepping into these very important roles and providing that information?
For the survey one, you should maybe
Do the
for the
academics
research
think
and
that?
survey
Yeah.
one, you should.
Don't everyone answer at once.
Okay, all right.
I'll jump.
I'll answer at once.
Get them young.
The-
Start
the-
them young.
the-
Listen. Yeah.
The solution to the problem of research is to take a national representative sample and not just do surveys of the community.
Right.
Yeah.
Among other things, we still have very, very little idea of how representative the BDSM community is for all the people who engage in variant sexual practices.
Study is
No
coming out next year.
idea.
Yeah.
The closest we come is to some work that's been done in Quebec, and Herbenik has done something this year that's been published, and if I can get the money, I will do one. But the fact of the matter is, if you stigmatize something enough, there's no way you can use science to just solve that problem. You're going to get biased response caused by there is no methodology that makes it possible to answer the question without being in danger. And people experience danger to participate in this community, and it's basically their decisions are rational about where they want to be out and where they don't want to be out. And when you try to solve our problems by asking people questions, you have to do that from a position of empathetic respect for their willingness to participate or not participate. It goes right back to the other things I've heard almost everybody on this panel say about respect. If you don't, you're sunk. But
You have to respect
that's
the no.
But the fact of the matter is, you cannot expect the larger society to care enough about this to pay the freight to do the research, which is why it hasn't gotten done all this time. Because let's face it, kink wasn't invented last week. How is it that we've had a discussion about safe, sane, and consensual for 30 years, and the consent violation survey that we did happened in 2014? There's one happened in 2013 in Holland, and there was the one that we did in 2012 that made us do 2014. We went 30 years without even asking the questions. Why? Because the resources aren't there to do it. And because the methodology wasn't there to do it. Heck, we would have never had a survey if it hadn't been somebody came up with the internet and FetLife. Where would we have found the people? Well, there was a time when nobody could find anybody. This is the age of contact magazines and email services. People still found people. But it's a fundamentally different world. And in fact, it keeps changing all the time. So where people are vulnerable keeps changing too. That's an imposing research task. But if you don't do it respectfully and you don't ask everybody, then there's certain questions you can't answer.
So I see some positive changes with our youth. The surveys that we do have on their opinions about alternative sexualities, lifestyles, belief systems are far more liberal and open than any previous generation. So I'm seeing the openness and the willingness to at least hear and not walk into a room with preconceived ideas that are so locked in like their parents that they're concretized and their hearts aren't open. So I do see the positive. I'm witnessing it even over the last 7 years of being in the academy. Every year there's more openness. But right behind it, there's also an increasing fear to step outside of their own personal growth because they want to fit in so badly and they are absolutely glued to their electronics. So no electronics are allowed in my classroom. Everyone has to write their notes and I make them just jump from group to group so they can't go back. I see the positive changes and I think the dominoes are going in the right direction.
So let me actually ask a follow-up to that real quick. So I was recently reading an article about how in the wake of the Summer of Love, the Jesus People movement beginning in San Francisco effectively gave rise to the Christian right, and how much influence that had. You had a lot of people coming out of a very brief period of time with a lot of free sexuality, drug use, all these things that were glamorized, and then they found the reality was a lot of sexual assault, a lot of really terrible experiences leading to homelessness, drug dependency, and no outlet but to turn except for what eventually became the Christian right wing, and then the liberal values fell by the wayside and repression returned in force. So how can we guard against that? Because I think that brings us back to our fundamental consent discussion is if we don't protect these young people and make sure that they have positive experiences in this community, will they continue to advocate for this community?
Well, remember that the Summer of Love really was predicated on two main fronts. One was the geopolitical realities, what were happening around the world, but the other was the freeing of women to make choices about their sexuality and not get pregnant. This was
That's
huge.
right.
And the freedom to love as you wanted to was ruling the day. I don't know if the statistics will bear out that there were more assaults, but more women were coming forward at that time because there was a sense of personal entitlement that was growing. And it was nascent in the 50s, but in the 60s it really started to grow. Where I felt, I grew up in the 70s, there was a lull, there was an inuring in our society. I think I'm seeing a shift now. Students are really, they're seeing the reality that other people are making decisions for them and their agency is being eroded. They were taking it for granted and now things are being taken away. So I think it's a positive energy, but we do have to support and make sure we don't go back in time and have personal rights eroded.
I don't think anyone's going to deter the young and newer kink generation. When I say young, I don't mean age. I mean, as far as kink scene community experience, they're much more consent aware, and they're much more consent ready to act. And I believe that no one's going to deter them from that, and that we are going to see positive changes. Because the sad, fact is, we may have been having conversations around SSC for the last 30 years, but let's face it, the C was pretty much left out up until the past maybe 5 to 8 years. And so we're finally seeing people pay attention to consent issues where only the powers that be were prior to that time.
We had C as a publicity piece. SSC really started as a way of trying to reassure people who are trying to make decisions about whether they wanted it in the community, whether it was safe to do that, rather than having consent as a living, breathing process in the communities.
It wasn't.
It doesn't mean that nobody had ever talked about consent before. They sure as hell had. But in terms of it being a consent culture, no. I agree with you. It wasn't a consent culture until fairly recently in that 30-year history. So there's room for a heck of a lot more progress. I think the most hopeful sign is the fact that the, excuse the term vanilla, I don't mean it pejoratively, culture is having a discussion about whether they have enough consent and how are we going to fix that. And the first fantasy is we're going to have universities fix us for it, and that is being called into question because there's big political conflict about that. But there is in that a positive, and that's the recognition that consent is important, and that people need that, and that's a moment of opportunity for us, and it's a moment of opportunity for the larger culture.
Sorry, you were.
No.
I think, and I feel like your question speaks so much more to larger political questions about social justice that are happening and that are happening right now. And I mean, we've been in here for 5 hours, so I bet there's another executive order that just fucked over a whole neighborhood. And so,
No one checked Twitter.
Let's all check Twitter.
I know every time CNN is like breaking news, I'm like, oh god, I can't. I just can't right now. And I think that it's a really valid question. I mean, this is part and parcel to every social justice conversation. Sexual freedom is an outgrowth of so many other conversations about bodily autonomy and about privilege and about access. And I think that the question is, social progress is not linear. It's never been linear. And so are we moving towards the progressive goals that we want? And I think the question that has to be asked is, are we taking the people who are the most marginalized and lifting them? Because necessarily the people who are less marginalized are going to be lifted as well. It's going to be easier. And so, when we have conversations of consent, are we talking about the reasons and the core reasons why the people who experience the highest levels of sexual assault and consent violations do not either feel their boundary, why they're getting, why people feel comfortable assaulting them. If you look at, and are we breaking this down in a really relevant way? If you look at, I think it's 1 in 3 overall women experience sexual assault. And if you break that down by race, it goes exactly as you would imagine it would break down by race with I think, mixed race women, it's something like 60%. Are you centering the voices of the people who are most impacted by this conversation and really addressing the root causes of what people are experiencing and doing it in a really thoughtful way, which is, and I know I'm a broken record at this point, but it is anti-racism work, and it is undermining the narratives of who is a sexualized body and who is an available body, and talking about the way that poverty makes people public figures because they have to exist as sexual beings in public spaces like homeless shelters. Are we devaluing very specific bodies? And the answer is yes. And if we're not doing that work at the same time that we're saying, like, all right, let's create this standard that incorporates when these very nuanced things that may come up in a court case, if we're having that discussion, we really have to have the conversation about why certain bodies are abused at a disproportionate rate and why they do not find justice and what justice for those bodies looks like and for the individuals who inhabit those bodies, I guess. And so if we're not having that conversation, like in terms of like the sexual freedom and love and Roe v. Wade was predicated on the right to privacy, which is an incredibly privileged experience that only happens in very specific cases. Lawrence v. Texas was about closed doors in a privately owned home by 2 people who are very clear about their consent. Neither of those things apply beyond the right in a lot of spaces. And so that's why you can shut down every abortion facility in Georgia and Alabama, because you can have the right to an abortion, but if you don't have the access and you don't have the $700 that it takes, and if you don't have the 3 days of work because there's a 3-day waiting period, then it doesn't actually matter. And that's why we're losing ground, is because we predicated so many of our arguments on the privilege of the people who are privileged enough to fight. And so if we're going to talk about long-term, progressive, thoughtful change, especially around consent, especially around domestic violence, especially around sexual violence, that we have to look to the reasons why very specific populations are being disproportionately assaulted and abused, and figure out how to stem those root causes and figure out what and how to actually find justice for those individuals if we're going to do anything that sustains longer than by the time you find a legal argument that undermines the thing you wrote.
All right, we are just about at the end, so I'm just going to real quick final thoughts. What's on the horizon that makes you optimistic? Maybe something you've seen today, something that you've heard about. Just real quick, right down the line, like 30-second words.
I ask my students, what are you willing to go on the streets for, to fight for? And at first they have nothing to say. And so I ask them, access to education, some people raise their hands. Access to a safe place to live, some people raise their hands, many of them are very wealthy. When I say, what about your ability to choose who you want to love and how to love? All the hands go up. I say, well, guess what? It's being eroded now, and you got to make sure you get some good sneakers because we're going to be out on the street, and I will be out there with you.
I see that we believe in our own value, and that our value, the voice has value, and I see that with people in my circle, a lot of younger people, and I think that we're coming together in a way that we haven't before, and I hope it continues, and I hope that as we move forward, we can check our egos at the door, all of us, myself included in that, because when we're holding on to our egos, we're not holding our hands open with each other.
And just right off of that, the conversations around consent and how our culture, how it's changed in the last 10 years, especially in the last 5 years, and to continue that and to continue moving forward, that's extremely, I'm looking forward to that.
I think for me, if I look at the NCSF timeline and what has happened over the past 20 years, it gives me a lot of hope because we've actually accomplished a lot in the last 20 years. And I just want to echo something you said about the youth of today. I think the youth of today are so much more fluid with sex and gender than people were in my generation or even my children's generation.
Yeah, and I think those changes are permanent. But I want to caution everybody that you don't know what you don't know until you know it. Don't mean to sound too much like Rumsfeld here about the unknown known and unknown unknown and all that stuff, but the fact of the matter is, if you'd asked me 7 years ago, is somebody going to write a romance novel about BDSM and change the entire conversation, I'd have laughed in your face. Sorry to have to admit that, but that's pretty embarrassing because, in fact, that damn book has changed, the series of books actually changed the conversation tremendously.
Yes.
And the conversation is going to change again. I also was not going to, I did not predict that Donald Trump was going to win and that we were going to get a backlash against identity politics in which a bunch of white, not quite middle class people anymore used the same tactics that other groups have used and said, we're not getting a fair share around here, let's change everything on its end. So it's entirely possible that the landscape in which we're doing what it is that we're doing is going to have things that change it that we can't even talk to you about from here. But I think the differences in the youth that we're talking about here, those are here to stay, even if the political environment is not going to reflect that for years.
Yes, you can't unring the bell.
That's right. You can't unring the bell.
I'm excited by how much we're going back and really looking at our own flaws. I feel like groups are reforming and tactics are being created, and everyone. I know that, at least in the circles I was in, we got cocky after 8 years of Obama, and we got real cocky when we thought Clinton was going to be in the White House. And so all of a sudden everyone's like, all right, something went horribly wrong, and we have to figure out where we didn't push hard enough and where we didn't use the right strategies and where we can do things differently. And as horrible as it is, I think taking stock and being really self-aware of your own movements and the ways that we can do better is such an important and valid space to be in.
And with that, I thank you all for participating. Thank you so much for
Thank you.